and the ills that we have. So along those lines, we will have Jerome with us this evening, and this is really a powerful presentation. And I want to set it up this way. I want people to understand this. First, I'm going to ask those that are listening, you might want to grab a pen, piece of paper, pencil, note tab, whatever you take notes on, your phone, computer, and jot down the things that you hear this evening, because some of them are going to be very critical in their presentation and critical in their analysis. And just as we on Connecting the Dots have brought you several topics, several scientific topics, because what we do here at Connecting the Dots is the basis of science and technology, and as we say, beyond human freedom, so that's the condition that we find ourselves in. The topics that we introduced to you of nanotechnology, of protein sequencing and protein engineering. Well, this evening's topic, psychology, you will find us here at Connecting the Dots that will make the contention that psychology is very important. Outside of how it has been marginalized and presented to us, you're going to find out that literally everything that we do is a function of our thoughts. As my mother would say, where the mind goes, the ass will follow. So it's critical to understand, as we look upon this pantheon that exists out here, that psychology, although it is now being presented to you as a science that is almost somewhat inconsequential the way that academia treats it to some degree, particularly the way we treat it in the social sphere, I think psychologists and psychiatrists are very important entities to our society. When you start looking at the structure and the pillars of society, one of the voices, the two of the voices I think that are critically missing from our ability to analyze and correctly identify the things that affect us are psychologists and social scientists. And I think it's one of the reasons that they have been systematically and systemically they have been pushed to the side of the page, to the margins, to the periphery, because it is through their voices, through their analysis, through their industry that really a lot of things could be connected if we held them in higher esteem, if we really understood what psychology is. So just like we did in January when we presented to you gradualism in the classroom, and we showed you how the science of psychology birthed the educational system and the educational format in this country, its highly significant role and it's the systemic development of education. That's what psychology represents. And when we presented to you from the perspective of Wilhelm Wundt to Ivan Pavlov to G. Stanley Hall to the American Psychological Association to John Dewey and to the formation of the National Educational Association, we have made the attempt to connect for you how things got formatted, how the educational system got co-opted, and how psychology played a role into filtering people into a position where today, as you know, in the educational system, that most of us are either miseducated, undereducated, or not educated at all. So development of psychology and education in the Western world, you will find out it goes hand in hand. But this evening, I want to stress to you, this evening you are going to hear an absolutely critical analysis that aligns itself with the work of, let's say, the United Independent Compensatory Code System concept and textbook workbook for thought, speech, and actions for victims of racism. Some people may recognize that long title by Neely Fuller. That's 1984. You'll find Dr. Fox's works aligns itself with the ISIS paper by Dr. Francis Wesson. That's 1991. It aligns itself with the psychopathic racial personality and other essays by Dr. Bobby Wright. It aligns itself with the change in images of psychological slavery by Naeem Akbar, 1984. And it most definitely aligns with the multiple works of Amos Wilson, including his classical work, Developmental Psychology of the Black Child, 1978. And that is a classic for some of us. That was a key book in our development. And then you have today You have the psycho-academic Holocaust, the special education and ADHD wars against black boys by Philadelphia's own Dr. Umar Johnson. So we look upon an honor tonight to have Dr. Fox present his work, whom I actually love this title. And I think this title really says it all. The title of his pending book to be published, his soon-to-be-published book, is called Addicted to White, The Oppressed in League with the Oppressor, A Shame for Alliance. A serious workbook for those who want to overcome. That is a hell of a title. So, without further ado, Dr. Fox, how are you, sir?
All righty, and good evening to you and the listening audience. Can you hear me?
Yes, definitely.
Good. All right, let's jump right into it. I'm a man of few words and mostly business-oriented. So Harambe literally means, quote, all put together in Kiswahili. Swahili is the land and Kiswahili is the language, which we interpret as working together in unity. I believe that what I will be offering tonight is all put together, and thus in the true spirit of your weekly forum. Let me begin by informing your audience that all the ideas presented this evening are contained in my soon-to-be published manuscript, just as you said, which is right now protected by federal copyright laws. For most of our time together tonight, I will be reading directly from this copyrighted manuscript. In my manuscript, I ask, what is it that binds the African to the white oppressor in today's world? Then I attempt not only to answer this question, but to go farther and offer a solution to what I see as the principal problem facing Africans residing in every corner of the world today. In fact, 95% of my book is devoted to laying out in meticulous detail a solution for releasing black people from the grip, better yet, spell of the white oppressor. I stress solution in my book because problem solving is a process involving 4 major steps. Step 1, describe the problem. Step 2, generate possible solutions. Step 3, test one possible solution. And step 4, evaluate the outcome. And repeat steps 1 through 4 until satisfied. Sometimes people are daunted by the mental rigor and courage required to tackle any step beyond the first one, which is describe the problem. Or the problem's description inherently defies resolution. When the problem is interpersonal, the merry-go-round of four-flushing and epithet slinging may be enjoyed too much to even want resolution. Partisan beliefs and preconceptions may make the problem's solution and evidence that supports it undesirable. Whatever the reasons, though, often the process of problem solving grows no taller than a descriptive dwarf. So again, what is it that makes the African join in league with his white oppressor? Well, first, let me explain. There are a couple of rules that appear at once to define and sustain any relationship, good or bad. Rule 1, both parties in a relationship must give as well as take. Both parties in a relationship must give as well as take. Rule number 2, the net value of all that is offered by each giver must be desired by each taker. All contacts among men and women rest on the schema of giving and returning the equivalents. An outside observer may not be able to tell whether the parties in a relationship are receiving what they desire. But if the relationship endures, it is safe to assume they are. Sometimes desires are not met, and the hope of fulfillment sustains a relationship for a while, but not forever. Equivalencies must be exchanged, or hope and the relationship will eventually expire. This seems to suggest that the African would be well served by taking a more serious look at what white oppressors is offering him. If shown that the oppressor's goal is nothing more than the alchemist's gaff, which is a false goal, perhaps the African will be moved to dissolve her unholy alliance with the white oppressor, freeing both parties to pursue healthier interactions and a brighter future. In any case, the African will have to change his own thoughts and behavior first in order to prompt reciprocal change in the white oppressor. All righty. Just give me a second here. All right. I want to turn to a page in my book. Let me just get to it. Sorry about that. Okay. I begin by saying that in black neighborhoods, cocaine was originally considered an elite pleasure. Notice the emphasis on elite. And thus was given the name white girl, if you recall. A code that reveals a subtler, even more formidable white habit, which is the subject of this text. 2 years, I don't want to go there. Let me just, okay, hold on. For the past 600 years or more, the overarching result of white people in contact with Africa has been the emotional and material degradation of black people worldwide. Africa is the seat of the world's oldest civilizations, dating back many millennium before the savage onslaught of Europeans who raped the continent of its human and natural resources and decimated the literary and monumental testaments to its greatness. Although driven by a complex combination of economic and psychic factors, the merest of genetic quirks responsible for skin color, that is, a change in one DNA base pair out of about 3 billion, has been for centuries the basis of poorly pigmented people's antipathy and malice toward their more richly pigmented global neighbors. Long ago, a attributional template in black and white was created and superposed over the natural world by the poorly or sparsely pigmented people to advance their own so-called white lives only. And all peoples have been sheepishly acquiescing to this template ever since. Wherever you look, both continental and diasporic Africans seem to be inextricably locked in a de jure or de facto apartheid state vis-a-vis their white counterparts, with whites occupying the upper echelon and blacks stuck way beneath them. It should be clear, therefore, that any honest analysis of world history must begin with the ideology and practice of white supremacy. Otherwise, as Neely Fuller contends, everything thought to be understood about black and white relations will produce only confusion. So let us begin there by further unraveling, beyond the beatdowns and the shackles, how the practice of white supremacy has succeeded in dominating African people for so long, and what, if anything, can be done about it. As anti-African sentiments along with a network of other misanthropic values settled immovably in the bowels of white culture. Africans were force-fed these same values as guideposts for living. But what began as force-feeding has now become idolatrous acceptance of the same, which has served only to implicate the African in her own demise. Many constructs have been enlisted to illuminate the perverse complementarity of the oppressor and the oppressed, but no idea seem more serviceable than the twin constructs of addiction and recovery. Chemical dependency or addiction may be defined as primary, chronic, progressive, and potentially fatal. Primary because addiction is not a symptom of some other disorder, rather a separate disease. Chronic because once contracted, the addict may never be entirely free of the disease. Progressive because addiction follows a predictable degenerative course. Potentially fatal because if left untreated, addiction may cause death. Give me a moment here. Let me just get up here a second.
We just give it time for Dr.
Go ahead.
Just give it time. Don't just let the audience know he's giving you time to get your basic.
Okay. Right. A three-tiered pattern of symptoms develops in addiction. The first tier of symptoms is the physiological consequences of chemical dependency, including tolerance and withdrawal. The second tier of symptoms stems from the addict's attempts to manage guilt and shame. Overuse of a restrictive range of psychological defenses like denial is the typical result of these attempts. The third tier of symptoms involves family dysfunction and other social problems. The hallmark of chemical dependency is the compulsive use of the drug, even in the face of all these symptoms. Without compromising the essential features of conventional definitions of chemical dependency, John Bradshaw posits a model for understanding addictive behavior that can be applied to a variety of mood-altering experiences. As it will be shown shortly, Bradshaw's ideas are strikingly user-friendly when discussing the politics of oppression. According to Bradshaw, shame is the bedrock of addictive behavior, and training for the shame is usually some form of abuse from people who have or have had authority over the addict. Addicts are trained to believe that they are flawed and that no one could love them as they are. They engage in substance abuse or some other mood-altering activity like sex, overeating, gambling, or Uncle Tomism to reverse the shame caused by these beliefs. Unfortunately, the addictive behavior has bad consequences that only cycle the addict into more shame, then relapse, and around she goes. The above discussion of addiction has been brief, admittedly, and perhaps simplistic. Nonetheless, the African's relationship to the white oppressor bears undeniable resemblance to the disease of chemical dependency. My basic premise is that Africans are addicted to an oppressive white value system which has frustrated their natural quest for life, liberty, and, no, not happiness, blessedness. A grave obstacle to Africans' well-being lies in their ideological entanglement with a white social order that is predicated on narcissism, greed, and violence, what I call the Negev. The Negev is a Hebrew word meaning southward, literally, but downward or decadent informally. The Negev of the white social order produces, respectively, the racism, poverty, and militarism Dr. Martin Luther King referred to as triple evils engulfing the lives of most black people. Once again, that foundation is predicated on narcissism, N, greed, G, and violence, V, the Negev. By ceding their spirits to the white oppressor's misanthropic, Negev-based value system, Africans have sought refuge in lies and have made a covenant with death and with hell. This book aims to annul that covenant and provide guidance to Africans who wish to recover from their addiction to white. The relationship between Africans and their white oppressors is that of a child to an abusive parent. Because a child's sense of self is constructed and sustained in relation to others, parental abuse calls into question basic human relationships and the child's faith in a natural or divine order. The denial of normal attachments of family, love, and community throws the child into a vortex of incompetence and grief as he tries but fails to stop his abuse or at least make sense of it. Subconsciously, he may conclude the only way of escape will be to join his parent in hating and destroying himself. A mind rendered batty and hopeless by an abuser's steady pummeling will always turn on itself. During adolescence, perhaps the child may turn to illicit drugs as a means of coping with the emotional fallout of abuse, unaware that drug addiction will cause more, not less pain in the long run. Through this process, however, the parent is kept alive, as the anger the child invests in self-abuse would otherwise be inflicted upon the parent. Similarly, Africans have formed a pathological attachment to the feared, abusive white oppressor and have adopted a coping strategy, that is, addiction to white values, that ultimately preserves the life of the oppressor and the abusive relationship. To paraphrase another author, the action of using white values substitutes for acting in a way that would correct the African's sense of inadequacy and express her smoldering rage directly at the source of her humiliation, which is white oppression. It is worth underscoring that oppression not only dehumanizes its victims, but also infantilizes them. With a childlike dependence upon white oppressors, it is not surprising to find black adults unable to self-discipline themselves or their community when, in quotes, home alone. Remember that movie? In their cribs and hoods, cribs are for babies, without white supervision, or mumbling and mispronouncing like toddlers with limited vocabularies when conversating and rapping. Let's pause here to define a few terms. Values are ideas, constructs, or beliefs toward which people have an emotional regard and to which they are behaviorally committed. Values may be positive or negative. As used in my book, however, the term white value denotes negative values that are disseminated, often subtly, by white oppressors to arrest the development and prosperity of all persons other than themselves. Oppression is the systematic, unjust, and cruel exercise of authority by one social group over and against another social group. The oppressor's behavior is characterized by genocidal assaults, exploitation, punishment, miseducation, scapegoating, put-downs, and restriction of the oppressed. The response of the oppressed ranges from desperate protest, fear, appeasement, sulking, and apathy to rigid imitation of the oppressor. Let's examine now how addiction to white values operates by first letting me list about 5 major ones. The first negative white value is everything white is good or supreme. Everything black is bad or inferior. This imbalanced perspective is strengthened by subconscious directive to summarily dismiss any person or activity that dares to challenge it. Like the late Khalid Muhammad, or even, believe it or not, Sam Greenlee, the author of The Spook Who Sat by the Door, who can't even find a job in a black university or a black studies, Africana studies department today. If he's still alive, I have to check on that. I know he's one of our elders. Tangibles, value number 2, white value number 2. Tangibles are valuable. Intangibles are worthless. Hence, things are to be pursued more vigorously than relationships. Value number 3, white oppressors are trustworthy recorders and interpreters of history and reality. And I have all kinds of examples of how we serve these values later. Value number 4, individualism is better than collectivism. Hence, obligations to the group are subordinate to personal gain. This value is an extension of the erroneous Western concept of self as a disembodied, isolated, asocial entity. In contrast, self as a dynamic, constantly expanding entity that embodies the selves of all others is a concept that fosters a much greater sense of belonging and mutualism. Value number 5, the best way to feel good about yourself is by surpassing, outdoing, and defeating someone else in an activity, achievement, or personal characteristic. This value is a corollary to the preceding one, the individualism one. Under this value, artificial barriers are erected to foster irrational competition and strife among people, and to suffocate the breadth and range of interests that all life forms share. These 5 white values have become metaphysical and epistemological commitments so commonplace that they rarely rise to the level of explicit consideration or discussion. Nevertheless, as Amos Wilson concludes, to the degree that the values blacks use are originated by whites is the degree black behavior falls under white control. And he's absolutely correct. Earlier, addiction was defined as primary, chronic, progressive, and potentially fatal disease. Does the African's addiction to white values fit this definition? I say a resounding yes. Africans' addiction to white values is not merely the consequence of some other problem, but a primary disorder with its own unique constellation of secondary symptoms. Africans chronically cling to the notion that the white worldview is trustworthy and useful despite persistent and recurrent social and economic problems caused or exacerbated by this notion. The course of addiction to white values is indeed progressively degenerative, as African morphology and culture are abandoned gradually in favor of white aesthetics and institutions. Africans' addiction to white values is more than potentially fatal. Pushed into a tidal wave of white, money-centered, hedonistic ideas about what it means to be successful, powerful, masculine, feminine, and even human, African communities are drowning in an angry deep of death and destruction. Africans display the first tier of addictive symptoms in the way they pursue goals imposed by destructive white values and in their response to challenges to forsake the same. Tolerance to a chemical occurs when increasingly larger amounts of the substance are needed or even required to achieve the desired effect. Tolerance is mimicked in the increased number of anthropological features that an African may feel the need to anglicize, sometimes at great risk to his health, in order to soothe a battered self-image. First, the hair is straightened, or so-called texturized. Then the nose and lips are altered. A cleft in the chin, like the actor Kirk Douglas, may be added, followed by carcinogenic skin bleachers, and so on. You know who I'm talking about. Tolerance stalks the physical alteration drug in the same way it eventually overtakes the African's use of more and more non-essential commodities, including trophies, to escape the pain and shame of cultural deracination. Ethics and integrity are forsaken in curbside scams to acquire the non-essentials white oppressors equate with security and contentment, but in truth have nothing to do with these spiritual states. This compulsive overvaluation of things and the lack of balance and priority in life it signals can make winning an NBA championship game seem more important than the Rodney King case and its riotous aftermath, particularly when both are occurring at the same time. Like in 1992, Michael Jordan cried while hugging his second NBA championship trophy, but publicly expressed no sadness over the miscarriage of justice in the Rodney King police brutality case. Kobe Bryant chose to distance himself from a friend who needed him as an alibi in court. Maybe Kobe was worried about how his association with this defendant might affect his image and, perhaps more importantly, endorsement portfolio. Ironically, his own misconduct would diminish his cachet later on. Not only professional athletes, but black celebrities in general seem to possess a child's mind made dangerously vain by the attentions and rewards of white corporate America. They become inflated with an indefensible sense of self-importance, though still slaves to convention and derelicts in their support of black issues in order to chase the things their egos, or more accurately, ids, desire. When they do express support of black issues, it is usually through anodyne or weak symbolism broadly permitted by white oppressors. Sometimes, for the delight of white oppressors, they train an uninformed critical eye on their own race, effectively blaming the victim. When detoxification is attempted, the African who is strung out on white values predictably displays irritability, anxiety, and even tremors. These, in quote, withdrawal symptoms become so noxious that the African quickly returns to the white value system to medicate herself, saying, quote, white folks do it, so why can't I? The African grumbles as she imbibes yet another destructive value, that value being white oppressors are model human beings. You know, white folks do it, so why can't I? As if they were models of how people should act in this world. The dependent African, rather than rejoice, shakes at her very roots when presented with the truth about her lost culture and her potential for recovery. Followers of the late Elijah Muhammad reportedly have observed these symptoms in hooked-on white folk Africans, while urging them to renounce the false tenets of white supremacy. The second tier of addictive symptoms supports the first, as the pathological use of denial and minimization dramatically decreases the probability that Africans will ever enter and maintain recovery. Africans deny that their behavior, tastes, and attitudes reflect destructive white values. The whitewashed African adamantly denies, for instance, the prodigious influence that the mythical productions of white-controlled mass media, entertainment, and news wield in protecting and promoting anti-African sentiments. He also denies that Eurocentric education generally serves less to impart knowledge about the world than to shape positive attitudes about white oppressors, their habits, and their institutions. Indeed, only profound denial can explain why African people continue to accept this crippling indoctrination. Africans should be planting independent schools in their communities with the same urgency that marked the planting of trees in drought-stricken areas of Africa years ago. Oppression, however, is traumatic, and the denial of the fact of oppression, the impact, or really the fact of trauma, and the impact of trauma, and the responsibility to fight back is typical of many trauma survivors who wall off in their mind the horrors enacted upon them in order to avoid going slowly and inexorably mad. Third-tier symptoms of white value dependency ensue naturally from the first two tiers and include an assortment of psychological problems. Child rearing and group cohesion suffer as Africans act out white values. The movie Wall Street Guru declares, "Greed is good," and the antiphonal chant of Africans is, "Mo money, mo money, mo money, ka-ching, ka-ching." The self-images of African children from all socioeconomic strata are hobbled by their own parents' addiction to this white worldview, and it's fundamentally anti-African and anti-social foci. In short, the African home is converted into a spiritual death trap under the influence of white values. If, as Bradshaw declares, every addiction has as its core neurotic shame and a distorted attempt to find love, then white value dependency may be construed as a survival-driven attempt to extract vitality or love from parochial white oppressors by obliterating differences and becoming white in thought, if not in color. Underlying this search for relief from tyranny and abuse is, ironically, a correct appreciation of the role a loving, supportive social climate plays in the well-being of any people. But failure to anticipate the death-dealing consequences of white values has left Africans with a sense of being unlovable, incomplete, ugly, primitive, expressively incorrect, religiously animistic, and lacking in wisdom and understanding. This pervasive shame is reinforced daily by the cunning narcissism and psychopathic dynamics of the white oppressor, who draws his African prey into a mirroring game of perpetual one-downmanship. The African seems to be caught in a lose-lose situation. His efforts to become white kill his soul and body eventually. On the other hand, maintaining his different but authentic self is equally risky, as extreme narcissists like white oppressors often feel diminished by differences and may become violent in some manner as a result. Although stubborn addiction to white values is correctable, moreover, spiritual liberation, the only kind of freedom worthy of a struggle, awaits those Africans who unreservedly embrace recovery. Once again, we must turn to the field of drug addiction to find a strategy for recovery from white value dependency. Recovery from drug addiction passes through phases. During the first phase, the drug addict is in profound denial of the compulsiveness of his behavior. He insists he could abstain from using drugs at any time. Abstinence, however, is never chosen. An effective intervention during this phase is to educate the addict about the nature of the drug and about the consequences of addiction. The addict is cautioned that a leap of faith is needed to withdraw from the drug, as the pain of withdrawal is a strong push to relapse. The middle phase of this recovery process begins once the addict's denial is undermined. Accurate self-diagnosis replaces terminal resignation to the way things have been. Recovery focuses on ridding the addict of counterfeit pride and toxic shame. The goal of the final phase of recovery is sustained abstinence. To this end, the addict must accept that once the drug is ingested, he is powerless to control its effects and consequences. That's why he needs to stay away from it. After surrendering the notion of control over the effects of the drug, the addict is ready to reclaim the personal power he really does possess. During this phase, self-deprecating voices remit and a balanced, more accurate self-concept emerges. Self-worth is affirmed not as a function of mimicry or arrogance, but instead as a byproduct of honesty and integrity. Control, once a neurotic fantasy, is now well-informed discipline. This newfound discipline is codified in a relapse prevention plan. In an analogous fashion, the first step of recovery from white value dependency seeks to undermine blanket denial of its symptoms and costs, which include loss of self-respect, mental confusion, dysfunctional relationships, fear, and self-destruction. And we do this through an examination of white oppressors and the channels through which their values are packaged, pushed, and consumed in African communities. The second step of recovery attacks the white value addict's toxic shame and counterfeit pride through public confession of the impact of white values on current patterns of thought and behavior. Separation from the values and worldview of white oppressors marks the third and final step of recovery. The African comes to realize that she is powerless to control the harmful effects of white values once they are engaged. Self-knowledge and a commitment to universal principles involving sharing, service, humility are recognized as the only healthy alternative in recovery. All major blocks to recovery, including indolence, terminal acceptance of the status quo, counterfeit pride, toxic shame, and fear, are aggressively confronted. Uplifting, supportive ways of relating to Africans at home and abroad are identified and put into practice. Self-worth is affirmed not as a function of how well the African mimics the oppressor, rather how well she displays her spirit self in daily activities. Lastly, all of this is codified in a written relapse prevention plan. A rejection of the identity and world view derived from white value dependency appears to be the only way African people and their communities will ever again thrive. The following section details how to effectively apply the above recovery steps. And what I do there is I go through, I introduce the next section of this book, which I call Solutions. And I introduce the idea that we need to have self-help groups spring up in our communities, much like the Alcoholics Anonymous, to help us recover from our addiction to white values. We need this kind of support in order to do so. I go through how to set up these groups, the assumptions underlying these groups. One assumption being, although white value dependency appears to hook the African on a level outside of his full awareness, it is learned behavior and therefore can be unlearned. And I have several other assumptions. I go through how to, once again, literally set up these groups with the facilitators, what the qualifications of those facilitators should be. There's a model that each meeting would begin with. There's all kinds of things. There's a very specific, there's a very specific structure for these meetings in order to accomplish the work of recovery. I have a list or let me back up. I tell when perhaps new members can be admitted to what I call the fellowship. I have a list of thoughts for today that would be read at the beginning of each meeting. One of these thoughts, let me see, purpose of life is to make us humble, extrinsic, freedom is really living truthfully. Let me read just a couple of these thoughts for today. One, there's even a more important one, power. And I say that these thoughts should be read and not discussed, just meditated on. Power. Power is the ability to define oneself and reality, and the courage to live these life definitions with perfect acceptance of their consequences. Whereas power is intrapsychic, it's in your mind. Influence is interpersonal. Still, we choose whose influence we will accept. Many of us reject people like, let's say, a Minister Farrakhan, but fall in love with an Al Sharpton. So even there, we're exercising our power to decide whom we're going to allow to influence us. There is no greater force on earth than the ability to define the concepts that direct behavior. Let me just read another thought for the day. No, I won't do it. A slave. A slave is one whose range of affect or emotion is restricted to shame and fear. Collectively, we as Africans are the progeny of cowards, those who surrendered to this slave mentality in exchange for physical survival only. Physical survival only. Now, I know that's very controversial, but I believe very true. What is worse, our inherited cowardice has led us unwittingly into modern-day slavery, devouring, exploiting, and neglecting each other at the silent behest of our oppressor. Let me see if there's another one. There's another final thought for the day. The misogynist lyrics of black rap music are yet another catalyst for African self-hatred. If the proper target for these ranting arrows were in view, that being white oppressors, there would be no thought of calling black women bitches and hoes for sport or business. Ostensibly, the violence, vaunt, vulgarity, and hyper-virility hawked by wannabe mythic rap lyricists harken back to a period in time when New World Africans were forced to cope with the anomie or disorientation and utter despair of captivity. At least that's how the story goes according to some brokers of the black experience. It does appear that today's rap icons and their stories are rooted in yesteryear. Are you still with me?
I'm still with you.
Okay, because I could hear my phone in the back. Okay, that's something else. It does appear that today's rap icons and their stories are rooted in yesteryear, but not as the dreamy archetypes of an African slave culture, as Shelby Steele concludes. No, these are recycled stereotypes that blood-sucking white slavocrats originally manufactured to skewer the African spirit. Surveying the brain's deepest, grimmest crevices in the hope of finding something defensible in these borrowed banes or poisons is tantamount to searching for a paltry penny in a pile of poop. In general, stereotypes of African people and their cultures have served to justify the ideology and practice of white supremacy. Number one. Number two, project into Africans disavowed elements of the white supremacist own nature, and oddly provide an acceptable means, like minstrel shows, for the same white supremacist to subconsciously reconnect with his disavowed nature. He claims we're oversexed, when in truth he's oversexed. But we've, following, book-to-book, right behind the white oppressor, we try to become what he stereotypes us as being. Okay, so that's as I give these thoughts for today, and as I said, the structure, I lay out the structure for these meetings. Then, in laying out the structure, I mentioned that my self-help group is a 3-step, not a 12-step, but a 3-step process. The first step being self-understanding. Just 1 second. The first step being self-understanding, which is accomplished by explaining the white oppressor. And I have a list of the characteristics that maybe, if there's time, you might want me to follow up on. And by acknowledging the pervasive impact of the white oppressor's values on African life, and by committing to recovery from these same values. The second step is self-disclosure, which is accomplished through telling personal secrets and connecting these secrets to white values. And the third and final step is self-transformation, which is accomplished through practicing behaviors free of white values, and basically restoring our spirit self. All right, let me get down. And then I just start laying out step A, step B. In step A, I give examples of how we serve each white value. Well, really, at first, I describe the oppressor, and then later I think I start giving examples of how we serve each white value. And in the group or the fellowship, after a description of some of the ways we serve these values, fellowship members are asked to reveal how they serve these values. And finally, I basically talk about the fellowship facilitator and what characteristics that person must have in order to manage a group of this sort. And these groups would just be meeting in people's homes, etc. And as I said, second phase, self-disclosure, I have created a list. Let me see if I can't get to that list really quick. A list of topics that the group should select from. Here we go. Should select from in order to spark conversation. On the list are the following topics. Let me see. The first one is discipline, and once again the task is to discuss their own problems with discipline, self-discipline. Envy, money, anger, guilt and shame, fear, escapism, sex, love, adult gender roles, relationships, weapons. Weapons is extremely important. I spend a lot of time talking about weapons and the following topic, which is self-hatred, which maybe if there's time I'll have the opportunity to elaborate on these two, weapons and self-hatred. And then forgiveness. And as I said, the following, and then following that, I give an example of a sort of fictional member of this fellowship group that I'm trying to construct, and his relapse prevention plan. And I give an example of a initial relapse prevention plan, and then a second one after he's been in fellowship for a while. And you can see the contrast between the two once his mind is cleared of these white values. And that's pretty much it.
Dr. Fox, your thesis, and I just want to somehow get this back centered with the audience, because you have given an extreme amount of information. I know some people out there feeling somewhat overwhelmed by all the things that you have enumerated here. But we want to just take a step back for a second, and we're going to go with your title, Addicted to White, the oppressed in league with the oppressor. And the thing I think is key here is the word of the phrase of shameful alliance. Mm-hmm. So when you talk about the level, or you begin to enumerate, I should say, the addiction and the behaviors that will qualify as being addicted to white, most of the things that you're describing is the actual totality of our behavior. Our whole epistemology essentially is what you're saying about the black culture in this white world, vis-a-vis this white world. Our entire culture is based upon the need for the
mimicking white people
and being addicted to white folks. Mm-hmm. I know there's some folk out there that are extremely disturbed by that phenomenon, because that is a, if I can say in a colloquial phrase, that's an entire mouthful to say, and many people do not want to examine themselves and analyze that their behavior vis-a-vis their educational system, the work that they may do, the families that they have, the structures that they have, is all based upon white folks and the way white folks do things.
Yes, could I go ahead. I just want to give a few examples
No,
that
and I
might
help. I want you to speak to that, because I think that if we're going to use that, let's use that as a starting point, so people can critically understand exactly what this means. So when they go through this self-evaluation process, if they are choosing to be honest about it, you have given them some type of tools and some type of assessment tools of how to look at this thing and how to examine it for themselves.
Okay. Well, I think the best way, and obviously, I know time flies, but certainly in running a group, I would begin, or the facilitator would begin this whole topic of how your own life reflects white values by giving examples of other prominent black people. So let me do that, and maybe perhaps the audience will be able to identify themselves to some degree. The first value you recall is, everything white superior, everything black inferior. One way Africans react to white values is to accept them as true and abandon themselves to acting out those values. Too many black people, all cut from the same burlap sack, are in perpetual, I say genuflection or bowing at the altar of white values. Africans who live in the United States frequently speak of wanting a piece of the American pie, as if it were inherently superior to any entree of their own making, considering that the ingredients that compose white America's pie, P-I-E, are unearned privilege, that's the P, covenant infidelity, that's the I, and aggressive egotism, that's the E. Considering that, the African's desire for the same is a formula for mental, if not literal, fratricide and suicide. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the suicide rate among young African Americans ages 10 through 19 more than doubled between 1980 and 1995. Besides factors such as drugs and the availability of guns, the CDC suggested one reason for the higher number of suicides may be the growing black middle class and the stress that comes with, quote, making it. Blacks in upwardly mobile families may adopt the coping behaviors of whites who kill themselves more frequently in response to stress and depression. One example, the parents of the late Isaiah Shoals, a black student who was terrorized and eventually shot to death by what I call gang-banging white students at his elite suburban high school, regret not heeding the warning signs of racial targeting at their children's school. They thought their children were quote, strong enough to endure the targeting. The Shoals admitted they were convinced, that is until the murder of their son, that residing in white suburban Columbine, Colorado, was improving their lives. Their thinking was an obvious endorsement of the mythic superiority of white culture, which blinded them to the most serious consequence of leaving their children in a racially charged school environment. Sadly, many Africans are willing to suffer the oppressor's abuse just to be in his wonderful presence. One can hardly name an African American man in the public domain whose romantic partner is a richly pigmented black woman with a wide nose, full lips, and short hair, which she proudly flaunts, doesn't try to cover up or extend. Black men are the only people who overwhelmingly prefer women who are or look like they are from another race. People are attracted to images that present their ideal aesthetic and themselves. The black man's ideal partner, being white, reveals just how profound his self-hatred is. Colorism runs deep in the veins of black people in general, which is simply internalized white supremacy. Colorism was carefully forged over centuries as a caste management tool in the hands of white oppressors, massas, who historically treated blacks differentially based on the amount of expressed pigmentation in their skin. Given so few sources of pride and privilege, beneficiaries of Massa's favor embraced colorism wholeheartedly, leaving the rest of blacks longing to be light, if not white. Both of these embattled camps, hopelessly in league with the white oppressor. The idea of serving value number 2, things above relationships. When hip-hop mogul, Sean P. Diddy Combs, visited Paris to promote one of his albums, he shipped, among other items, 18 trunks of clothing and 45 pairs of shoes. Reportedly, an additional room was booked exclusively for his wardrobe. This was just one of many occasions that Mr. Combs' ostentation upstaged his musical act. When interviewed by GQ magazine in 1999, he explained, quote, my race needs to see this. Needs to see this. Now, this imbalanced value white oppressors give money and materialism is painfully evident in Mr. Combs' assessment of the mental needs of Africans, but leaving no room for doubting his love affair with everything white, ideas, values, aesthetics, you name it. Mr. Combs later confessed, quote, white is a color I dream about all the time, unquote. He added, I feel safe in white suits because deep down inside, I'm an angel. Of course, angels, in his mind, would never appear in black. Ostentation and white value dependency do not cure self-loathing. They only mask it temporarily until the next breach in the African's brittle self-concept sends him flying back to the store for another dollop of imitation pride. I won't deal with Willie Gary, the lawyer, unprecedented literacy. The third value, that whites are trustworthy recorders and interpreters of history and reality. A group of black, I'm going to skip that. Well, I'll deal with it. A group of black college freshmen was asked by the history professor, quote, what was Reconstruction? What images come to your mind about that era? In response, the students regurgitated every lie the white authors of their secondary school textbooks told them about black Reconstruction legislators. By accepting the perspective of these white authors, the students unwittingly endorsed the mythic superiority of white rulership. Because the prevailing function of Western education is to normalize values and beliefs that support white hegemony, examining white historians, commentators, social theorists, and reporters for racial bias should be a reflexive reaction for Africans. But it is remarkable how accustomed Africans have become to seeing life through the eyes of their white oppressors.
oppressor.
Ever since 1963, when Dr. Martin Luther King stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and addressed the throng of anxious and weary sojourners, his words have been dubbed by white media as the, quote, "I have a dream" speech. This anemic title for his empowering words has endured despite the fact that Dr. King declared early on that Black America had come to the District of Columbia to cash, not dream about, but cash a promissory note, a centuries-old promissory note, granting all Americans equal status under the law. His dream rhapsody about what society should look like once white America makes good on its promissory note was an afterthought prompted by gospel singer Mahalia Jackson, who, sitting behind him, blurted, "Talk about the dream, Martin," because she had heard him do that, alliterative rhapsody before. The activist thrust of Dr. King's speech, however, demands a more accurate title, like "Now is the Time," which is one of several of what is called anaphoras, or repeated phrases, he uttered to accent the urgent collective will and agency of the people who gathered to pressure Congress to pass civil rights legislation. On the other hand, it is no wonder that white oppressors' media quickly glommed onto the weak phrase, "I have a dream," as a dream, by definition, is not reality and will remain abstract forever if no one is moved to actualize it or put it differently, cash in on it. From all indications, the white oppressor is perfectly satisfied as long as Africans quietly dream about, rather than fight to wrest it from his clenched cold fist. Dream about freedom, that is, rather than fight to wrest it. That's the... go ahead.
And now, give me a moment just to get this question out to you, because I think this is important that the audience understand this. You and I can definitely agree upon the fact that the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that was developed in 1952, I believe, is the standard that is used to classify and quantify what is known to be psychiatric disorders. So when you look in the DSM-4, the DSM-5 that we have now that just came out in 2014, I believe, one of the disorders that you will look upon is the disorder of addiction. And that has been consistent within the diagnostic manual since it's been established. So essentially what your thesis is, essentially what you're telling us in the African-American diaspora throughout the world, is basically that we are really some sick people. And
we're sick, but it's not incorrigible. But we need the same kind of help that, believe it or not.
Let me, Jerome, but here's the key to it. The key to it, and I think you and I can recognize this, the key to it, as any good scientist, any good pathologist, any good doctor is going to do, the first thing I need to do is identify what the problem is.
Exactly, which I've tried to do.
So, No, not just for you, but I'm saying for the sake of our audience. So for the sake of our audience, and encapsulating what the doctor is saying, it's important to understand that at some point we collectively, we in the greater sense, have to acknowledge that his suppositions that he offered here are based upon his clinical experience. And I should have explained to the audience that Dr. Jerome Fox, is a clinical psychologist, a practicing clinical psychologist for over 20 years. We're looking at a combination of literally his work to some degree that is pointing to the fact that at a very fundamental level, when you start to go through the enumeration of behaviors that he talks about, at our very most basic level, our addiction to whites symbolizes and reflects a degree of disorder that must be dealt with, must be acknowledged, and therefore, from that perspective, he has designed a program to help you overcome it. But we first have to acknowledge that we have this first, that we and the collective diaspora have this sickness. Because as he talked about earlier, much of our behavior, when he talked about the things that happens in the household, I want to use correctly the phrase that you used, Doctor, because I thought that was a key phrase. Real quick, about to go back in my notes when I was taking here. You said black homes are spiritual death traps, and that this is learnt behavior. And I think that's key, for at least for our audience, to somehow grab a hold of that, at least to understand exactly what you mean by that when you say that. So that's a broad-based statement, and it's very accusatory. I think it's true. I know you think it's true, but we need for the audience to understand why you're saying that's true.
Well, that's why I give the examples. If you don't recognize yourself in some of these examples, then that's just the an evidence of how deep into denial we are. But the households have become death traps because we're serving a death-dealing value system. Yeah, spiritual death traps, because we're serving a value system that leads to death. And it's not our value system, it's a white value system. And I explain what that value system is based on, the Negev, narcissism, greed, and violence. These do not lead to good life outcomes. And if we choose that value system, what we're basically doing is inviting death into our own bodies and everything around us, our own communities. And we see that. And as I said, for those who are not completely convinced, I give example after example after example that I think should be convincing. There's not time for me just to run the whole gamut of examples, but it's no doubt that this is indeed our problem, and that we can't really get at any other seemingly more pressing issue until we deal with what's in our heads first.
First, that's exactly right. Just a note real quick, Samuel Greenlee, he the author of The Spook Who Sat by the Door, died May 19th, 2014, so he just died a few months ago.
Okay, so he died last year. Okay, yeah.
Oddly enough, May 19th is Malcolm X's birthday, so he died on his birthday.
Yeah, interesting.
And it is interesting. And when you talked about addiction, when you identified addiction, you said that some of the behaviors of addiction, you called it chronic, gradual, and detrimental. And at least, again, to help the audience, because we need to get the people centered for the most part, that whole phenomenon of being chronic, and at the same time you say gradual, just define that again for people, so that I want people to make sure they understood what that meant.
Well, as I said, I forget where, let me see if I can find it, and it's to use the same words, although I depend to African. Chronic just simply means that without intervention, we will continue to one will continue to be addicted. Progressively degenerative refers more to the consequences of our continued addiction. Rather, we see the consequences, the degenerative consequences of our addiction to white values, like the value of putting things above relationships. We'll sell our brother and sister poison, i.e. drugs, in order to get the things that white people associate with being successful or content. And it's just not true. That kind of behavior does not lead to success or contentment. It leads to prison, death, or whatever. Anything but those spiritual states of being. Now, if you can't see that in our communities and the destruction that just something like that has wrought in our midst, then once again it just shows the how deep and how profound our denial is, and the fact that eventually fatal if we don't do something about it. We see that all over and over and over again. Our kids being killed because our parents have not really trained revolutionists how to respond and protect yourself in an oppressive environment. We just lead them out to the wolves, so to speak, to become target practice for white cops going wild.
And then real quick, just for a point of clarification, the other day you were talking about the example of Michael Brown, and I thought that was a very good example to highlight the point that you just made about our lack of preparing and making our children aware of what they have to contend with and what they have to deal with.
Right. If we were doing the job that we should be doing as parents, and making the building of warriors our first priority, we probably would still be assaulted and attacked, but our response would be so much better. But many of the kinds of incidents that we're running into today is because our children, our people, don't know how to respond to the oppressor's white values, except to try to join them. When even during the riots during the 1960s, when the rioters were interviewed, most of them said what they really wanted was a place in white society, having not really examined what that really means. And that's what I'm trying to get at here, that there are alternatives to the life of the rich and the white and the famous. There are alternatives to that, better alternatives.
Those?
Well, as I said earlier, living in harmony, sharing, caring, humility, basic alternatives to selfishness, arrogance, exploitation of others as opposed to helping others, and the spiritual states that those two types of behaviors create. The grasping, greedy, me results in us neglecting our responsibility to raise our children properly, often while we're at work, trying to get that money. It results in us, once again, selling poison to our neighbors while we're trying to get something for ourselves without that kind of, group perspective. The interesting thing about it is that if we were able, and people have been saying this for centuries, but if we were able to unite and pool our resources, we have all that is needed to provide a decent life in service not to the white oppressor and his values, but to our God. We have all that is needed, the genius and the resources, but we're too busy hoarding like white folk, copying white folk, and just not cooperating with one another. His basic strategy, I have a section in this book detailing this. His basic strategy is to divide and conquer. And Boogity Book, right behind him, we are more than eager to claim how black people are not a monolith. We just love saying that. And our white oppressors love hearing us saying that. Now, while it is true, we know that every human being was made uniquely with its own unique qualities and beauties. But what we need more than anything at this time in our struggle is to identify those areas in which we have something in common and allow our commonalities to comfort each other and promote each other and take care of each other. We don't need to be told how different we are and you know, almost object to being unified. That serves the purpose, and we don't even know that that's an idea that has been planted in our head. I heard a movie, an actress recently spout those same words. Well, you know, not all black people. Oh, right. I think it was the star, Diana Ross's daughter, the star Blackish. Her whole talk about the show was that it's trying to show, you know, how not all black people are monolithic. That's not a point that can help us overcome our difficulties. Unity, and our enemies know this. Unity is a required weapon to fight oppression for any people who may be oppressed. But we spout these things not even knowing where they come from. I'm just thinking of let me get to this weapons part. Let's see how far, let me see if I can say a little something about, okay, remember the topic, one of the topics is weapons, anger, guilt, shame, escapism, sex. Where are the weapons? Relationships. Weapons, there we go. Fellowship members may be puzzled by the topic of weapons. To structure their thinking, the facilitator should ask members to prepare a list of weapons, or as social scientists would say, protective factors for resisting white oppression that are typically undervalued or completely overlooked by the black community. Just as medicine is seldom recognized among the fare in our kitchen cupboards, members may have ignored weapons well within their reach. For instance, research on child-father relationships suggests that children who do not get along with their fathers, though they live with both parents, are more likely to smoke, drink, and use drugs. While this may be just another interesting finding to some, to Africans, it has to be used as a weapon. African fathers have the ability to rear revolutionists, to instill in their children a desire to fix what is broken, embrace the struggle, in other words. Another weapon, research reveals a stable, mature household with both parents on one accord and actively involved in child rearing protects children from academic failure, criminality, incarceration, premature sexual activity, and future poverty. Not to be denied, black parents and the communities in which they live reap the added benefit of elevating their own development to heights unachieved and perhaps unachievable without the experience of raising children. In short, stability, emotional and financial, should precede procreation. In general, African adults must be more purposeful and intentional when having children, and nurturing them to be Afrocentric, humane, disciplined, courageous, truthful, insightful, persistent, socially and intellectually smart warriors. A well-developed ethnic identity is another weapon many Africans refuse to pick up. A study on drug use among blacks found African American adolescents who strongly identify with their communities and culture are less vulnerable to risk factors for drug use than adolescents without this identification. Awareness of African history and tradition, identification with positive black friends, and participation in black cultural activities such as Kwanzaa and African rites of passage inoculates African American adolescents against drug use. Memory as ammunition for this weapon is also key. There is no authentic ethnic identity without the memory of one's true history and heritage. Clearly, the emphasis some blacks place on associating with, like that Scholl family, associating with and emulating whites would be better placed on remembering, exploring, and enjoying their own African heritage. But there is an indispensable weapon Africans must learn to unholster and aim at practically every white opinion and prescription for living as quickly as they are issued. This weapon happens to be boldly handled by children. But this weapon is put under lock and key by most socialized, or what I call socially silenced, adults. At once innocent, potent, irritating, and immensely liberating, this weapon happens to be the simple question, who said? As mentioned earlier, the white oppressor demands the absolute loyalty of her African vassal or slave, but rapid and repeated firing of who said is guaranteed to liberate the African from her numbing tether. Who said the color white represents goodness? Who said long, straight hair is gooder than short, so-called nappy, kinky hair? For that matter, out of whose poison well were the words nappy and kinky plucked? And who decided to apply them to the beautiful, naturally tight curls that protect the African skull? Who said hair straighteners should be called relaxers rather than degraders or debilitators, as the elliptical shaft of naturally curled hair, which is our hair, is higher on the evolutionary scale than the cylindrical shaft of naturally straight hair? Who said sparsely pigmented skin is prettier than richly pigmented skin? Who chose the words light-skinned and dark-skinned over the more scientific phrases sparsely pigmented skin and richly pigmented skin in the first place? Who said business has to be exploitative? Earlier I talk about a business in this book. Who said capitalism is better than socialism? Who said Martin should be celebrated and Malcolm ignored? Who said Martin and Malcolm were not on the same page with equal regard for peaceful change wherever possible? Who said black people can play the race card as opposed to simply respond to the race card when played by its creator and exclusive holder, the white oppressor? You know, white oppressors will accuse us of playing the race card. I tell them, no, I can't play something that I didn't create and exclusively hold. I can only respond to your racism. Who said the voracious social media and ever-changing, ever-expanding I brands. I this, I that, iPhone, I this, I that, are all good and not mere commodification and justification of pathological insularity and breathtaking narcissism with all these selfies and all that other nonsense. Remember, narcissism, greed, and violence. The African spirit is far more about we than I. So all this I crap we need to put aside. Who said the British royals should be esteemed rather than denounced, given the massacres and plundering their kingdom represents? To effectively resist the narcissism, greed, and violence codified in the white oppressor's value system, the African must ask at every turn, who said? Who said? Who said?
That's right. That was well said, Doctor. It really was. And here you have a clinical psychologist, people, coming from his years of experience and his education. He is bringing before you very fundamental concepts about what we're doing and why we're doing it and how they impact us. What you are hearing this evening on Harambe Radio and on Connecting the Dots is actual critical information. It is important to understand the clinical value that he's offering, and that even with the academic veracity in which he's offering it, what he is really saying to us as a group, and how he has supplied us with information and tools of solution, tools to overcome, just like he says in the title of his soon-to-be published book. This has been, Doctor, this has really been a very enriching and rewarding. And
can I give another weapon?
Oh,
let me give another weapon. And this, I avoided some of the more controversial points I make in this book. One of which you sort of drew out of me regarding the the Michael Brown case. But here's one that just know that my intent is not to offend, but to hopefully liberate and uplift. Now, many Africans claim to love and serve the one and only living God. But for those who make this claim, a Christian scripture makes this counterclaim. Quote, they feared the Lord and at the same time served their own gods, both their children and their children's children, as did their fathers. So do they unto this day. That's from 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 33 and verse 41. Now, there are so many false gods Africans serve. White people, unwieldy pride, and so forth. However, there is one counterfeit deity in the African's pantheon that needs to be transformed and weaponized immediately. The Bible calls it gluttony. About 30% of the world's population is overweight or obese. 1 in 5 children in America today is overweight. And African Americans contribute mightily to both statistics, adult and child. Yet African Americans appear to be oblivious to the urgency of solving this problem. A wealthy, universally popular black TV talk show host once tearfully confessed she was loath to reduce her weight because she feared her audience wouldn't like her anymore. I think she was referring to her white audience. Ironically, a short time thereafter, 2 very fit white women on another TV station jokingly confessed how difficult indeed it would be for them to like the famous talk show host if she were to become svelte, shapely and sexy, in addition to being super rich. They preferred the stereotypic obese, asexual mammy look, maybe to satisfy their wealth envy and desire to still feel superior despite the black mogul's much greater success. In any case, the black talk show host was willing, apparently, to grant these white women their preference, risking her own health to do so. An annual televised gospel singing contest is typically overrun with morbidly obese African American hopefuls, either oblivious to or in defiance of their all too apparent sin. Once again, the sin of gluttony. They may sing, quote, "All to Jesus I surrender all," but their all never includes their considerable heft and the gluttony that maintains it. Life is an endless series of choices, and black people ought to choose health in every sphere: mental, physical, sociopolitical, and so forth. Obesity is not okay, no matter how many times white people say it is. The black community cannot afford, to lose its geniuses, philanthropists, in essence, its strength, prematurely to the almighty spoon. Food substances, including spices like salt and sugar, must be selected based only on their contribution to health. Taste buds can be trained to adhere to this mandate. Consider the simple diet that sustains the healthy growth of infants: mother's breast milk, period. The only growth that the typical black American diet, overloaded with salt, sugar, and fat, promotes is that of tumors, blood clots, hypertension, heart disease, and a menu of autoimmune diseases. Making food the centerpiece, like for Thanksgiving and Christmas, of family and other social gatherings might not be such a great idea. See, when your mind is free, you can think of this. You can think alternatively. More asceticism, that means self-denial, may be what is needed for now. Who said African American gastronomy has to be synonymous with gluttony or conviviality? If food as a social lubricant cannot be abandoned, you just can't stop having these, Thanksgiving or whatever dinners, then let there be nothing but healthy entrees, raw fruits, vegetables, legumes, seeds, nuts, freshly squeezed juices, and water on the platters. And let the ascendant theme of, quote, eating and drinking to live, unquote, envelop the guests with a warm sense of truly being cared for by the host. Just another weapon that we can, and then I talk about this a bit about divide and conquer, and then education. Self-hatred. I'm looking at that. Self-hatred is one of these topics that would be discussed in the fellowship. One reason for blacks hating themselves is the victim stance they have adopted vis-a-vis the white oppressors. A victim is despised for his lack of agency. The African's lack of agency is evident in his psychological dependence upon whites. The intense joy and gratitude with which Africans typically receive handouts from whites appears to spring from the notion that all would be lost if it weren't for the occasional benevolence of whites. This is oddly redolent of the slave's ecstasy over a little holiday cheer for masa during Christmas time. Bill Gates of Microsoft donated $1 billion to the United Negro College Fund, and with no deliberate pauses, Africans hailed him as yet another Messiah. Africans could have examined first the values attached to his pot of gold. For example, the conditions he set for dispersing his gift elevate the acquisition of technological skills above a liberal arts education, and push African recipients to prepare for the fastest growing sector of the global economy, but not for the challenge of rethinking the values that shape the global economy. Technical so-called progress, when separated from civic morality and duty, turns out to be inimical to the well-being of humanity. White philanthropy has always meant control, and Bill Gates' gift is no exception. Even if Mr. Gates' direction is harmless, his gift represents in the minds of dependent Africans more proof that only whites can rescue black people from misery. That's why I was glad that Oprah built her school. That cut across that. While the billions of dollars Africans waste on recreational drugs, expensive cars, and Eurocentric hairdressing are ignored, dependence upon white philanthropy and welfare checks deepens. It has been said that Africans should stop begging whites to do for them what they can and must do for themselves. Minister Farrakhan. In terms of promoting agency within blacks, this is good advice. It perhaps would be better for Africans to view the Gates gift as intergenerational reparations for intergenerational exploitation of African people. Mark Twain gave financial assistance to one of Yale Law School's first black students the same year that The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which has been attacked as racist, was published. Twain wrote to Yale Dean Francis Whalen, dean of the law school, quote, "I do not believe I would very cheerfully help a white student." Now, this is a white man talking, who would ask a benevolence of a stranger. But I do not feel so about the other color, that being blacks. We white oppressors, I put in white oppressors, we white oppressors have ground the manhood out of them. And the shame is ours, not theirs. And we should pay for it. 8 decades later, if I talk about reparations in terms of just, philanthropy. 8 decades later, in 1965, United States President Lyndon Baines Johnson reasoned, quote, "You do not take a black man who for years has been hobbled by chains, liberate him, bring him to the starting line of a race, saying you are free to compete with all others, and still justly believe you have been completely fair." That's a quote from President Johnson. As too few whites agree with Samuel L. Clemens, that's Twain's real name, and President Johnson, Africans are forced to dig deeper to discover answers to their seemingly permanent underclass status. Whites will never give reparations unless we do something different. Having a few white advocates and some richly pigmented faces in places once believed to be impossible to desegregate has not erased the social and economic injustices superglued to the vast majority of black people across the globe. Let me just, it's regarding the inferiority. Let me just go ahead and read this. According to journalist and Internet talk radio pioneer Junius Stanton, the answers lie in Africans recognizing their mental vital, killing the mind, attachment to a racist, Eurocentric worldview, and in rejecting the same with all of its lies regarding supposed inferiority of African beauty, intelligence, beliefs, cosmologies, and traditions. See, we're all saying the same thing. I know we're coming close to 9 o'clock. Maybe I'll stop here and give you a chance to insert.
No, we got 6 minutes left, Doctor.
Okay, well, let me keep going. Another basis for black people hating themselves is a strong dislike of Negroid, so-called Negroid features, an aversion white oppressors have relentlessly codified in every gyrus of the African cerebrum. Since his invasion of Africa, the white oppressor has leveraged his lifestyle by brutalizing the African self-concept. He has treated Africans with dismal and disdain, giving rise to a well-nigh inoperable tumor of chronic shame on the African personality. He has exalted European beauty standards by negating African ones. The white oppressor knows that a poor self-concept squelches independent thought and invites enthrallment or enslavement to others. To develop a better self-concept, Africans must stop associating beauty, excellence, and intelligence with being or acting white. Though breaking these linkages in the neural circuitry of blacks is made difficult by the lack of exposure to comprehensive and correct images and facts about Africa. Pick any popular TV show, The Housewives of Atlanta, for instance, and the average diasporic African is likely to know of it, even if you don't watch it. You're likely to know of it. Ask the same black person, what new African country was created in year 2011? Just 4 years ago? And she is just as likely not to know the answer. Now, you ask yourselves, audience, do you know the answer to that question? It happens to be South Sudan. So securely is Africanness nestled in an obligatory system of shame that even when controverting black facts are known, they are not included in white definitions of beauty, intelligence, or any other positive attribute. One does not have to know about Kemetic civilization, for instance, to be considered smart in most parts of the Western world. White trivia quiz shows like Who Wants to Be a Millionaire or Jeopardy in the USA, the United States of America, seldom ask questions concerning Africa or black people in general. And when they do, white, highly educated contestants most often don't know the answers. Let's see.
No, Doc,
Faced with ubiquitous, let me just end with this sentence. Faced with ubiquitous, unmitigated anti-Africanism, every black person must seek out all the more diligently a true knowledge of herself, as the quality of her self-concept hinges on the accuracy of her race concept. And I'll stop there.
You know, you have just listened to Dr. Jerome Fox, Ph.D., clinical psychologist, present his theses his soon-to-be-published work titled Addicted to Whites, The Oppressed in League with the Oppressor, a shameful alliance.
No, it's a shame-based. We've been made to feel ashamed. It's shame-based.
A serious workbook for those who want to overcome. And you just got to hear the doctor in his presentation encapsulate many of the things that you hear us say on Harambe Radio. And he does it from a perspective of academia and clinical perspective about the things that, not ills, the things that affect us. But more importantly, what's the beauty in this presentation is that he offers tools to overcome, how to get past this, how to acknowledge it, and how to make ourselves healthy people going forward. We think this program that we offered you tonight here on Harambe Radio and on Connecting the Dots was very important, crucially important. And we immensely are looking forward to the publication of his book. And when he does publish it, we will definitely let you know here on Harambe Radio. On behalf of my co-host, who's Dr. Till, the people scientist, who wants to express his thank you for being here, Dr. Fox, Jerome, I touch my heart and I say, man, I am so grateful that you came on this evening and that you presented your thesis. I want to thank you.
All right, thank you.
Until next week, people, join us again on Connecting the Dots. Until that time, peace.